question I'm interested in uncovering is which alternative indicator to GDP would best measure well-being. GDP is the standard metric of economic growth and only measures the size of a country's economy and doesn't reflect a nation's well-being, which is why I feel it is important to try and find an alternative that actually measures the well-being of a nation. Focusing solely on GDP as a way to measure its economic growth ignores all the negative effects that come along with it, like climate change and economic inequality, which affects people of color at a much higher rate. It is an economics question because it is about a real-world situation that deals with the social system. Since GDP produces shortcomings, like the fact that no positive or negative effects that arise during the production or development stages are taken into account when it comes to a nation's GDP. I do not believe it to be the best measure for well-being. It is misleading because, for example, GDP will take into account the positive values from sugary candy that is sold in the country, but will not affect the health problems that is caused by them. An alternative measure to using GDP would be the Fordham Index of Social Health, or FISH for short. It functions in the same way other measures would, by combining multiple indicators to produce a single number for each year. FISH is based on 16 indicators: infant mortality, child abuse, child poverty, teenage suicide, teenage drug abuse, high school dropouts, unemployment, weekly wages, health insurance coverage, poverty among the elderly, out-of-pocket health care costs among the elderly, homicides, alcohol-related traffic fatalities, food insecurity, affordable housing, and income inequality. 2011, which is the most recent year for which complete data is available for FISH, 50.2 out of a possible 100, which happened to be 5 points below the most recent peak in 2007. This was due in part to the Great Recession beginning at the end of 2007. Since GDP does not provide us with a sufficient assessment of our country's strength, progress, and well-being, it would be beneficial to see how FISH would allow us to look more deeply into who we are, where we are headed, and what issues we must address. Since most social data is only released once a year, the best way to analyze FISH data over time is to review them over several decades. The indicators that encompass FISH affect individuals, however, they do not occur in isolation but interact to shape how our society functions. They are closely linked to both the stages of life and to social institutions such as the labor market, social welfare programs, the school, the family, and well-being of life in general. Monitoring these 16 indicators tells us more about the quality of life in America than GDP ever could. The limitations to answering this question is the fact that the data for FISH is not as complete and cohesive as other measures of economic well-being. The most recent data as of right now is 2011, but that is not the worst case scenario because trends of social data are most beneficial to look at over decades because that is when the most meaningful change is shown. It is clear that there is not as much research on FISH as there is GDP due to it being the way we currently measure economic well-being, so that is another limitation that comes along with it. The assumptions that we need to change in order for my answer to be incorrect would be that FISH does not tell the whole story of societal well-being better than GDP does. It would have to be found that FISH has the amount of shortcomings that GDP has, while also ignoring the negative aspects of positive economic growth, like income inequality. I am confident that my assumptions are correct because that it is showcased in the 16 indicators. They take into account even the negative aspects of society while still taking in the positive ones.